Okay, today we're going to talk about, I was trying to think of a clever title, like Divers Earthquakes in Many Places, but I figured I'd have to spend too much time explaining it. Jesus does tell us in Matthew 24 that one of the harbingers of the end times will be that there are earthquakes in divers places. And was looking at some statistics about that this week. Last year, there were worldwide there were about 120,000 earthquakes. Now, a lot of those earthquakes are pretty small and are really not noticeable. They would be probably smaller than what you would feel like if I ran up the stairs. You would notice that before you would notice a lot of earthquakes, if you're in the same house with me, obviously. And but there were 120,000. The interesting part about that is that over half of those occurred in the United States, the continental United States. And it appears, and when you look around, it does seem like everything's being shaken up. Politics is a mess. The world is a mess. We have weather events that occur with some regularity or that were occurring, and they would carry this qualifier that this is unprecedented. We've never seen this before. But the earthquake thing is, and I might have mentioned it briefly last Sunday, they think there's a slight slowdown, like milliseconds, in the rotation of the Earth. And when we're reaching sort of a point where that's going to cause a lot more major earthquakes over the next year. We know that in the past that's happened, but there are also a lot of other things that are converging at the same time, like solar minimums and the temperature of the sun and solar activity and that sort of thing. And they're all kind of converging at the same time. When you add on top of that things that are happening in the financial sector in our country, in the world, actually, there is a potential earthquake there. We saw the things. I'm sure you've seen all the videos of people shopping at Black Friday events and people fighting over a $400 TV and kids getting trampled to get a doll or whatever the hot item is this year. I don't even know what the hot item is. A lot of people are just going online now to avoid all of that mess. One of my friends on Facebook posted, he said, listen, if you're going out for Black Friday, please be courteous and be sure that you turn your phone this direction so you're able to get a wide angle shot of all the crazy people around you instead of this way, so you can get more in the screen. I was talking to someone, a tax expert, about the new tax bill that's coming out, or that they're trying to put in place, and it will be, I don't know how else to describe it other than for small business people, it will be a major disaster. They're going to take away the interest deduction, essentially. You can only deduct business interest to the extent that you have business income. It takes away the net operating loss carryback. Now, what does that mean? You don't even know what a net operating loss is. Let's say you operate your business this year and you have a net operating loss of $10 million. In the past, what you could do is you could go back and amend a certain number of returns to take that loss, like in prior years, and get essentially a refund. But they're stopping that. That'll have a huge impact, especially if the economy tanks. People will be taking the loss. You can't deduct your business interest unless you have business income. But if your business doesn't make any money, you can't take a loss because of your business interest expense that you're paying. And it's just a number of things like that. No state income tax deductions. If you live in a high income tax state, that's going to hurt you. Mortgage interest is limited. There's a whole bunch of things in there that I think are disasters. And to be honest with you, I don't trust either party in Washington to do anything that's in the interest of the American people. I think we're at that point. So we need to get rid of the fiction that there's actually one party there that might care. At least the majority of that, the party that, they care enough to do something even though they have the majority. And they don't even do anything when they have the majority. I mean, it's been a year, right? I don't know. It's very distressing. So all of these things seem to be converging at the same time. Here's just a little bit on artificial intelligence. This was from the New York Times recently. This artificial intelligence can actually build itself. Now, when these machines don't have a moral compass, what's going to happen? And I showed you the video of, what somebody thinks could happen with these little robots. They call it slaughter bots, and a problem. This is also something like now Bitcoin. To be honest with you, I've studied Bitcoin. I've read a lot about Bitcoin, and I'm not sure I understand it. I know it's out there. It's like an electronic currency, a cryptocurrency. It's supposed to be very secure, but they've told us a lot of things are very secure. And when things happen, they don't even tell us about it. Uber got hacked a year ago. 58 million people had credit cards, passwords, logins, and stuff stolen, and Uber didn't tell anybody. Now a bunch of people have been fired from Uber. But it happens all over the place. So when I hear people say, oh, this is totally secure, there won't be any problem, I don't believe them. And Bitcoin that, has risen to astronomical highs over what it was when it was first introduced. Let's say it was $5 for a Bitcoin when it was introduced. Now it's up to $7,000. And a lot of people have made any money, but it's a bubble. And what happens to bubbles when they get a little bit too big? They burst. And when they burst, it's a mess that happens. And so I'm concerned where it's going. Maybe this will be the one that gets by. There's been earthquakes all over the place geopolitically. Mugabe finally resigned as president of Zimbabwe after being in power for 40 years. And this is an article from the Foreign Financial Times in England. Crisis highlights China's role in Africa. China's everywhere because they want to get rare earth metals and they want to put in place and influence things, which is what all colonial powers have done in the past. But China is also turning more to a communist strongman model than they have in the past. And they're in the midst of a major real estate and financial bubble as well. And their economy now may be larger than the United States. So if they go into a major crisis, do you think it's going to have an impact on the world? At the same time, this is Angela Merkel won the re-election, and now she's having trouble forming a government. Now a few days ago, it said, oh, there's no way she's going to be able to form a government. They're going to have another election. Now they're coming out and saying, well, maybe she's going to be able to avoid the election. She'll put a coalition together to govern. But again, Germany is supposedly the most stable place in Europe, and they're having problems. And now people are talking about, Macron in France. France looks more stable than anybody else. But Macron, who said last year that or earlier this year, he was going to govern like a Roman god, whatever that means in his mind. He was going to govern like a Roman god. His approval ratings in France are lower than Trump's are in the United States. And nobody's popular. Steve Bannon, whether you agree with him or not, gave a speech the other night, and he talked about the fact that Merkel and Macron, he calls them the Ken and Barbie of globalism. And he said this: they're extremely unpopular. Merkel just had a horrific election. He reminded listeners, predicting that the anti-mass migration alternative for Germany would have performed even better had it been able to purge itself of neo-Nazi leftists. or had been able to purge itself of neo-Nazi interests and interests more thoroughly. Merkel can't even put together a government and is really feeling teetering this weekend. They may have to have another election. The election of new boy Emmanuel Macron, this is from Breitbart, was supposed to represent the tide turning against the conservative insurgencies overtaking the establishment. But weakness on terrorism and radical Islam, along with bizarre pronouncements of intention to govern like a Roman god, have rapidly alienated voters. Bannon was scathing, appraising the Frenchman, Macron, as incredibly vapid and highlighting the fact that his approval ratings are down into the high 20s. This is an example. This is a little video of the Museum of Europe in Brussels. Now, we know that Europe has been historically a continent that was largely Christian, Catholic or Orthodox Christian or some other form of Christian. So they have a museum in Brussels to talk about the history of Europe. Now, they have this display. This is a new exhibition at that museum talking about Islam in Europe. Very well done, very incredible graphics, beautiful displays, and that sort of things. The museum doesn't even mention Christianity. But it mentions Islam. Now, I'm told that there's hardly a mention of Jesus at the new Bible Museum in Washington, D.C. I'd like somebody to check that out and confirm it. I'm concerned that it might be true. And so we have a tendency, we're so desperate for good news that anything that happens, marginally good news, is that, well, we'll latch on to anything. And I think I would be concerned that if a Bible museum didn't really mention Jesus or the gospel, it should be of major concern, because it seems that that message is central to the Bible. So, in the midst of this, for the first official visit to the EU in 22 years, Prime Minister Netanyahu is making plans to go to Europe early next year. We'll see how that goes. And by the way, if I seem a little bit disjointed to you, I want to confess up front. I've had major computer problems all week. For some reason, my computer seems to be running out of space. I don't even know if it'll make it through this. I keep getting these messages that I'm out of space. I moved everything to the cloud, and it's been a disaster. I spent 3 hours on the phone with technical support the other day, and the only thing we ended up doing was scheduling another call for this afternoon or tomorrow. So I don't even know if my computer is going to be usable in the very near term. So it's been very frustrating. I tried to record an interview with Brian Schrager this morning, and maybe it was supposed to be pretty good, but it was a disaster trying to get it a decent connection to even talk with him. So we're going to try to do something in the middle of the week and put it up. And he had some good observations. I'll share those in a minute. This was a very troubling thing. This is the worst terror attack in the history of Egypt, which has had a lot of terror attacks, bus attacks, church attacks on Coptic Christian churches, attacks on mosques. This occurred in the Sinai, near the Mediterranean, and over 305 people were killed. What they did was they set off a bomb in or near the mosque. As people ran out, there were between 25 and 40, appears to be ISIS militants there shooting people as they ran out. This happened on Friday during Islamic prayer days. This picture of, these are the shoes of the victims, some of the victims that were there outside the mosque. Here's a little report about it from Fox News.
Militants attacked a crowded mosque in Egypt's Sinai Peninsula today. The death toll is in the hundreds. It is the worst massacre ever of Egyptian civilians by Islamic militants. President Trump calls it a horrible and cowardly attack. Egypt's president vows the terrorists will not go unpunished.
Today's attack in Egypt's northern Sinai province appears to have been as well planned and sophisticated as it was deadly. More than 230 people were killed after militants detonated a bomb outside a mosque in the small village of Bir al-Abed. Then, as fleeing worshippers tried to escape, some 40 militants in trucks opened fire, killing dozens more. Today's attack is the deadliest in Egypt's modern history, and it follows a significant increase in militant activity. For 3 years, an ISIS-affiliated group has launched a wave of violence, targeting both small security checkpoints and large religious sites, including the ancient seat of Egypt's Coptic Christian community. The site of today's attack appears to have been chosen not only for its remote location, but also because of the Sufi Muslims who worship there.
The Sufis are anathema to the hardcore ISIS and Al-Qaeda types, the Sunni hardliners. Within Sunni Islam, the Sufis are the mystics, the poets, the most tolerant.
President Sisi has promised countless times to stop terrorism and to protect Egyptians from extremism, but delivering on that promise so far, Mike, has proven to be far more difficult.
And this is the problem. This is from the front page of this morning's New York Times, is that the way Egypt usually attacks these terror attacks is they launch military strikes. They've been building up their military. They put... they have decent aircraft. They've gotten a lot of money from the United States and from other states to build up military, but it's not working. That's not how you're going to fight these ISIS-type terrorists. It's just by massive military response. You've got to get on the ground, root them out, get intelligence, that type of thing. And they're killing these people in this particular case because they're Sufis. It's a mystical branch of Islam. They're considered heretics, and because they're heretics, it's okay to kill them. And Muslims generally kill more Muslims than they do anyone else. So this is what the New York Times says this morning. They paint a picture about what Egypt does. They paint a picture of a stubbornly outmoded approach that is unsuited to the fight, and that perpetuates the mistake of successive Egyptian leaders. For decades, Egypt has seen Sinai through a military prism, taking an aggressive approach to an alienated local population. The military has engaged in summary executions and the destruction of whole villages while offering little to solve the region's deep social and economic problems, including chronic unemployment, illiteracy, and poor access to health care. Egyptian soldiers and conscripts are hunkered down inside heavily protected bases, venturing out in armored convoys that barrel down long, exposed roads. Over the past year, Sisi has welcomed a line of 4 leaders and gotten a lot of money, and the article goes on to say, this is just these tactics are not working, and the definition of insanity is trying the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So this is a major problem. So the fact that ISIS may have been defeated in terms of their land control up in Syria, they've been building up among the Bedouin tribes in the Sinai for some time, mostly in the northern Sinai. But the fear is that they'll move down to the southern Sinai near Eilat, where a lot of people vacation. There are resorts there. And what will happen when they decide to do that? And the Sinai is it's a huge, wide open expanse of land, mountains, desert. It's a big problem. Speaking of problems, this is something that was reported this week, is that after the election, if you remember, there was a resolution put in place that was going to be very damaging at the UN, that was being advanced by some of the countries there, that was very damaging to Israel. In the past, the United States has always vetoed those type of resolutions that are put forward at the Security Council. At the end of the Obama administration, Obama decided he was a total lame duck. He didn't have a majority coming in the Congress. He was out of power. So they were going to take off the mask and do to Israel, I think, what they wanted to do all along, but they didn't do because of political pressure. But after they lost the election, there was no reason to hide anything anymore. And so for the first time in UN history, the United States did not veto this anti-Israel resolution. In part of the process, though, Israel was concerned about it. Israel knew they wouldn't get anywhere with the Obama administration, so they reached out to the incoming Trump administration and asked them to help lobby and that sort of thing to get this thing put on hold. I don't think that's a crime. I mean, Obama went over to Israel and interfered in the elections over there. That's not a crime. And I'm a free American citizen. I can call up somebody and say, don't vote for that. And plus, they were contacting foreign leaders because they're going to be taking over in a short period of time. And you saw the criticism that came when they did take over. Oh, they're unprepared. They don't even know what they're doing. They don't even know who these people are. Well, now, because they reached out, now apparently Mueller is investigating Jared Kushner for having reached out to Israeli government officials. And I keep seeing these reports, people put them up on the internet about, oh, they're going to take down this, Clinton and that Clinton supporter and this thing of Clinton's. And I'll believe all that when I see it. Until then, I'll be highly skeptical. Israel and the U.S. right now are racing to head off of a major blacklist of major firms, Israeli and international firms that do business in the area of the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria. And this is typical. As this article says, Israel's the only country that faces an examination of its rights record at each of the Council's 3 sessions each year. Some 70 resolutions, or about a quarter of the Council's country-specific resolutions, have been aimed at Israel. That is nearly triple the number for the second-place country, Syria, where hundreds of thousands have been killed in a devastating 6-year civil war. But no, boy, Israel doesn't get it. Now, let's talk a little bit about what actually happened this week. There was a very important meeting that took place in Sochi, Russia, on the northern part of the Black Sea, near where they had the Olympics a few years ago in Russia. And it involved, first Assad met Putin, and then Rouhani and Erdogan came for a joint meeting with Putin. This is very, very significant. Now, a few years ago, when the conflict in Syria was going on, this was an editorial type cartoon that somebody put that I thought was very accurate, except for the part on the right. That's my addition, okay? That's my addition of what somebody else did. I'm not an artist. But you see what was happening in Syria several years ago and the way it could be graphically presented. You had Putin and Rouhani are shown to be the puppet masters of Assad. On the right here, you have ISIS, a graphic representing ISIS there near the CNN, and below it, you have ISIS being propped up and supported by Erdogan of Turkey and King Salman of Saudi Arabia. I think this graphic was from about 2015. That graphic is not represented. Now, a graphic over here on this side shows what Obama was doing. And the thing that I've said before is that the Persians in Russia are playing chess, and we're playing checkers. So, and they're playing with a queen, and we're playing with a checker that can move one square at a time. And if you've ever played chess and you end up with a king and a pawn, and the other side has a king and a queen, it doesn't last very long. You're going to lose because you're playing a whole different game. But what happened in Syria was hundreds of thousands, maybe 1 million people are dead. Over half the population doesn't live where they lived in 2011. They've in most parts of Syria, they've pretty much eradicated the Sunni Muslim population. Iran has come in. And so today, this graphic might look like this. Now you have ISIS doesn't have much land. It has a little bit, but not much. Hezbollah is being used as a pawn by Russia and Iran. They're still controlling Assad. You have the change in Saudi Arabia down here, trying to figure out who they're going to support and how they can intervene. And then Hariri from Lebanon over here, and what's he doing? There's a lot of things, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. So there's been a major change. There's this massive diplomatic flurry to go and settle things with regard to Syria. So the first thing they had was this meeting with Assad, and then here was Putin and Sochi just a day later or so welcoming Iran's leader Rouhani, their political leader, and Erdogan, and they had this meeting. This is very significant. This is really, now, one of the major views of Ezekiel 38 and 39 is that Russia, Turkey, and Iran formed this alliance of sort of northern kings that are coming against the land in the latter days. And you see, at least now, you see that alliance forming really for the first time that anybody can ever remember. Now, they haven't attacked yet. They're putting things in place to attack, and Iran will use Hezbollah. And then here's Putin and Rouhani on the left and Erdogan there on the right having their meeting. And this whole thing in the middle, this Middle East issue is changing, and you have all of these major players involved, all on the northern borders of Israel, and you have the changes going on in Saudi Arabia, and it's very interesting. Now, a week ago, there was this agreement that was entered into between Jordan, Russia, and the U.S., and the Russian foreign minister came out, says this: the way the Israeli media had reacted to the Russian-U.S. Jordan agreement and the statement by the Russian foreign minister Sergei Lavrov regarding the Iranian presence in Syria came as a surprise to me. This is from the Embassy of Russia in Israel. Russia consistently acts in conformity with norms and principles of the international law that legitimates the Iranian presence in Syria. The aim of this presence is confined to war on terrorism. To this end, Russia cooperates with Iran and Syria. Well, this is very troubling. This has been troubling to Israel, and they're very concerned about it. But I'll remind you, I did an update. I included this in an update a couple years ago, maybe a year and a half ago, about what's going on with Russia. And at that time, we talked about the fact that it appeared that Russia was trying to exert influence over a much wider area, including Central Asia, Turkey, and it's really a Eurasian strategy that they've had. There's this guy named Alexander Dugin, who's been referred to in some publications, I think in Foreign Affairs. He was referred to as Putin's brain. And he has established this philosophy. It's kind of a mix of nationalism or religion and mysticism that's been adopted by Putin. Seems to be followed pretty strongly by Putin. It was even followed by a guy named Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was very close to Putin. They were good friends. In fact, I used a picture of Putin at Solzhenitsyn's coffin at his funeral. And you wouldn't think that because Putin's former KGB and Solzhenitsyn spent time in the Gulag, wrote a very famous book about it, and lived in America for a long time. But he eventually, when the Soviet Union fell, he went back to Russia because he was really a Russian nationalist and he wanted a strong Mother Russia. So this Eurasian strategy to unite the Stan republics here in Russia and bring Turkey into the area of influence is one of these strategies. Now, it's taken time. The Alexander Dugin, one of those articles I showed you, this was written about almost 10 years ago. And now we see 10 years later that this Russian-Turkey alliance in this part and with Iran is coming to fruition. And this is something that a lot of Bible prophecy teachers have talked about for a long time. And I'm just saying is that now it appears to be coming true. In the Atlantic, a left-wing magazine that said the Middle East, this was a couple weeks ago, said the Middle East is nearing an explosion. And it certainly would appear so. I mean, a month ago, not too many people had heard of Mohammed bin Salman, the king, the crown prince, something soon to be the king of Saudi Arabia, his father, who's pictured here with Saad Hariri, the prime minister of Lebanon, that the king will step down, abdicate, and his crown prince son, 32-year-old Mohammed bin Salman, will come into place. This has a lot of implications about what's going on. I mentioned earlier that Russia comes out and says, well, we're only here, Iran, we're only here is to fight terrorism. And now Nasrallah of Hezbollah has picked up on this, and there was a good article by Seth Frantzman in the Jerusalem Post the other day about how Nasrallah is now putting on the guise that I'm the wise guy. He's the head of Hezbollah, a terrorist organization. They've been used to beat back anti-government, anti-Syrian government rebels. They've gotten a lot of training that way. They were sort of they've messed up Lebanon. Let's just put it this way. They're effectively in control of Lebanon. And Hariri, when he went to Saudi Arabia a couple weeks ago and said, I'm resigning, he resigned because he said, I'm under death threat from Hezbollah. But now Nasrallah comes out and says, well, I don't understand why people are against us. We're against terrorism. We're fighting ISIS. Why should you guys be worried about us? And I guess the best way to describe it is it's a bit of a ruse. Guterres, the head of the UN, came out and said that the rhetoric is getting pretty strong. This was just a report he issued to the Security Council of the UN this week, that there is a great risk of a Hezbollah-Israeli conflict in the very near future if things aren't amped down. Now, this is a good editorial cartoon, I thought, for Hariri, who went to Saudi Arabia and resigned, but now they've hit the pause button on his resignation. He's gone back to Lebanon. He's sort of getting a mulligan, I guess, on his resignation. Saudi Arabia has been trying to influence the situation there. Saudi Arabia would like Israel to step in and take out Hezbollah and Iran so they don't have to get involved in the fight. Again, we have this meeting that took place in Sochi where they're trying to advance Syrian peace, a very significant meeting. Now, another article in the Jerusalem Post talks about this, and the word coming out, I think this article in the upper left-hand corner is from the front page of the Jerusalem Post the other day, saying Russia dominates the summit on Syria. And it was clear that Russia was clearly in control of what's going on. I would highly recommend that you go to JerusalemJournal.net, look under categories, and go to the Chaim report, CHAIM, and look at the list of articles there. One of the articles there in that list says today that essentially Putin is now considered to be the oil king of the world because of the way he's orchestrated all of this. And this is what Putin wants. Some people say Putin is the richest person on the planet because he controls all of these Russian gas companies. But they said the tale of two photos was this other article in the Jerusalem Post on Friday, the Iranians in Sochi, Trump in Riyadh, and they showed the comparison between the two. You remember back in May, just before he went to Israel, Trump went to Riyadh and they put their hands, kind of like, I thought it was kind of a creepy ceremony where they put their hands on that globe, that glowing orb. And then here are the other people just the other day in Sochi, Russia, sort of joining hands. So in Riyadh, you had Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. Here you have Iran, Russia, and Turkey. And it's clear that there's this alignment that's going on. Here's what the article says. The Iranian foreign minister tweeted a photo on Wednesday of Russian President Vladimir Putin clasping hands with his Iranian and Turkish counterparts. No need for empty words or gimmicks, including glowing orbs, when you're busy actually working for peace and against terror. And so Zarif, the foreign minister of Iran, was essentially mocking what had happened in Saudi Arabia. Like, what are they doing? We're the ones who are fighting terror. Geopolitically, this is, I think, an earthquake is what's going on. And it's one that, it's because of the rhetoric that comes out of this that, well, we're just fighting terror. We're not bad. Why should anybody worry about us? I don't understand why Israel's upset. We're there on the northern border of Israel fighting terrorism. Do they want us to fight terrorism? And of course you want people to fight terrorism, right? Nobody likes terrorism. But you're doing it with people who, when they get things in place, have said they want to destroy and wipe out the Jewish state of Israel. The two photos are symbolic. Let's see here. The photo with Putin flanked by Rouhani and Erdogan is also symbolic. Two of the three authoritarian leaders, Putin and Erdogan, came to power more than a decade ago with the vision of remaking their countries. Both have been phenomenally successful. And remember, it was just a little over a year ago that Erdogan had to put down what appeared to be a coup attempt against him in Turkey. And while he has done a massive purge of people in leadership positions throughout Turkey, I think that in some respects, what he did, whether that was a made-up purge or not, the result was that many military leaders, experienced people, educators, press, all these people who've been thrown in jail, put out of their positions, I think it's weakened Turkey to the point where Turkey has reached out to Russia for support. And Turkey's supposedly a European country. They want to be, they've said that people think they want to be part of the EU. Rouhani, the supposed moderate, this article goes on to say, has been a successful president, signing the Iran deal with the Americans and presiding over his country's deepening involvement in Iraq and Syria. The Sochi photo projects confidence. The Riyadh photo provokes snickering. The trilateral meeting in Sochi was a historic first for the leaders. It focused primarily on Syria, where forces from Russia, Iran, and Turkey are all present. The meeting focused almost entirely on Syria, with only scant reference made to Iraq by Turkey and Iran. They back Assad. It says this, however, after 6 years of bloody conflict, there is a sense that the three countries might now be seeing more eye to eye than they did in the past. Turkey and Iran have been brought closer together by opposition to the referendum in the Kurdish autonomous region of Iraq and by the Qatar crisis. These countries don't share the same vision for the region, but both Iran and Turkey seem to see Putin as a leader they can count on. Trump's policy in the Middle East is more uncertain. And this is something that was noted in a number of articles that I read this week, is what's the United States doing? What's our policy there? It seems that the State Department has a policy, our military has a policy, and the Trump administration has a policy, and who's running the show? There's no unification to it. The U.S. doesn't back Riyadh's Qatar policy or its Lebanon policy. Egypt wants reconciliation with both Syria and Lebanon. Saudi Arabia, Israel, and other countries that have been threatened by Iran thought Trump would radically alter U.S. policy. Instead, almost a year into his presidency, little has formally changed. That is why Zarif mocked empty words. And this is typical what Iran does, that they, it's called, I don't know if I have another article in here, one I read, says it's called cheat and retreat. We cheat, we enter into an agreement, we cheat on it, we get called on it, we retreat a little bit, and then we're back to cheating pretty soon. And this is why the agreement that Obama and Kerry and others pushed to sign with Iran is not really worth the paper that it's written on, because they're going to cheat. And I think they're already cheating. But the interesting thing about this is, supposedly the United States is the most powerful nation in the world. Now, we can make a case that there are massive problems in our military readiness. I think we only have 3 battalions or brigades that are ready to go to battle. And we really need 30-some to sustain a 2-front war. We have 3 that are ready. We have problems with our aircraft. We have problems with our ships. Things haven't been upgraded for a while, and we've been putting people in. We have good military people, but frankly, the equipment and the people are a bit worn out because they've been in wars now since 2003, fighting these things, and on top of the chaos that's there in the Middle East, here comes Russia and Iran and Turkey saying, "No, we're going to solve all these problems." Now, this is from Khamenei's Twitter account, the religious leader of Iran, the supreme leader. "We hope a day will come," this is what he tweeted this week. "We hope a day will come when Palestine is given back to the Palestinian people. The day will be the Eid in celebration for the Islamic world. It will be a real blow to the arrogant front, and that day will come. Today, the issue of Palestine is the primary issue among the Muslim world, since it has been as an Islamic country usurped and turned into a means of sabotaging the security of several countries in the region. This cancerous tumor, the Zionist regime, should be fought against. A religious mufti issues a verdict that it's illicit." This was I think the top mufti in Saudi Arabia issues a verdict that it is illicit to fight against Zionism. This is a disaster. There are people within the Muslim world who act in such a way against interests of Islam and against the words of the Quran. They're hard amongst themselves and merciful to the faithless. There is a video that made the rounds this week, and this is a Kuwaiti journalist on Kuwaiti television talking about, asking this person, and there's a Muslim guy, and then there's this other guy there, and he says, "What about Israel? I mean, what do we know about Israel?" And the stunning thing that's said is, like it or not, Israel is a sovereign, independent, sovereign state. It exists, and it has a seat at the United Nations, and most peace-loving and democratic countries recognize it. The group of states that do not recognize Israel are the countries of tyranny and oppression. For example, North Korea does not recognize Israel. But this does nothing to detract from Israel or from the fact of its existence, whether we like it or not. The State of Israel has scientific centers and universities, the likes of which even the oldest and most powerful Arab countries lack. So Israel is a state and not a terror organization. This is stunning stuff that he's saying. As I was saying, is it a legitimate country? Yes, it's legitimate. It's received a legitimacy from the United Nations. My colleague, he says, called Israel a plundering entity, but this may be refuted both in terms of religion and politics. From the religious perspective, Quran verse 5:21 provides that the Israelites have the right to the Holy Land. Allah says, when Moses said to his people, "O my people, enter the Holy Land, which Allah has assigned to you." So Allah assigned that land to them, and they did not plunder it. The plundering entity is whoever was there before the arrival of the Israelites. Therefore, I do not go for obsolete slogans and terms, like Zionist plundering entity and so on. The fact that I am an Arab should by no means prevent me from recognizing Israel. I recognize Israel as a state and as a fact of reality, without denying my Arab identity and affiliation. I don't know. Let's determine the frame of discussion. Is Palestine and its occupation an Arab cause or a religious one, he asks. There's no occupation. There is a people returning to its promised land. Are you aware that the history of the Israelites is ancient, predating Islam? Therefore, we Muslims must acknowledge that the Israelites have a right to that land and that they have not plundered it. The people who say that it was plundered are still thinking in the mentality of the 1950s and before. When the State of Israel was established in 1948, there was no state called Palestine. This guy's going to get more invites to proxy conferences than I am. It didn't exist. There are various communities living in Arab countries. They were called Canaanites, Amalekites, or a whole host of other names. The Quranic verse even says, "In it are a people of great strength." Some people call them Jabarim. Therefore, there was no state called Palestine. I insist on this. To tell you the truth, I have reservations about the term normalization. I would prefer to call it peaceful coexistence with Israel, like Egypt and Jordan. And what was the outcome? Both sides benefited from it. Should the Arabs and Muslims stand with Israel against Hezbollah? Questions asked. The head of a major Gulf state said that he was ready to cooperate with Satan against the Persian entity. By Satan, he meant Israel. They call it Satan. But I say, why shouldn't we live in peaceful coexistence with Israel and cooperate with it against my great enemy, which is the Persian regime? The Persian regime boasts that it has occupied 4 Arab capitals and that it will soon occupy the 5th. Has Israel ever said such a thing? Has it boasted about occupying anything? No, because it never occupied anything. Israel came to its own land, whereas the Iranian-Persian entity is a plunderer. I support the establishment of a 3-way alliance consisting of Israel, the Arab Gulf states, and America in order to annihilate Hezbollah beyond resurrection. Well, that's kind of interesting. You can find that on the internet. It's all over the place. And Caroline Glick has a couple of good articles this week. One is her Tuesday column called "Holding the PLO Accountable." And she's like, are we finally going to hold the PLO accountable? Now, there were reports that, we're going to close their office in the United States because of what they're doing. There's been some backtracking on that. Well, we might only close it for they're on probation for 90 days, I think is what the Trump administration said today. But Caroline notes that there is this conflict in the United States government between what the State Department wants and what is actually done in the military and the Trump administration. And even within the Trump administration, there's a conflict over how do we treat these things. So a boss says, well, we want to stop contacts with the United States, and we won't even grant him his wish. At the same time that this is going on, Yoram Edinger came out with a report, and this is consistent with what Caroline Glick said in her book, The Israeli Solution, that a lot of the demographics of the Muslim population, the Arab population within the state of Israel, within the confines between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, are made up. They say there's 3 million Arabs there. There's really maybe only 1.8. And Edinger says this, and he notes this in his report that was just issued a couple weeks ago. The substantial systematic westernization of Arab fertility from 9.5 births of women in 1960 to 3.11 in 2016 has been a derivative of the accelerated integration of Israeli Arabs into modernity in general and the enhanced status of Israel's Arab women in particular. In 2017, the total number of Arabs in Judea and Samaria is 1.8 million, not 3 million, as claimed by the Palestinian Central Bureau of Statistics, which includes in its count over 400,000 Palestinians who have been away for over a year, over 300,000 Jerusalem Arabs who are doubly counted, and 100,000 Palestinians who married Israeli Arabs and received Israeli ID cards who also doubly counted. So, this is interesting. He goes back and looks, and we talk a lot about demographics because that's one of these things that's converging, this demographic collapse in a lot of Western societies and things that, which sort of put the window of some of this, I think, things in Bible prophecy happening in a very small window of opportunity. But look at what some of the predictions were made about demographics in Israel between the area called the Palestinian, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. In March 1898, the leading Jewish demographer and historian, Stan Dubnov, ridiculed the Zionist vision, claiming that by 1998 there will be no more than 500,000 Jews in the land of Israel. In October 1944, the founder of Israel's Central Bureau of Statistics, Professor Roberto Bacci, contended that under the best case scenario in 2001, there will be 2.3 million Jews in the land of Israel, a 34% minority. However, in 2017, in defiance of demographic conventional wisdom, there are 6.8 million Jews in the land of Israel, including Judea and Samaria, a 66% majority benefiting from a robust demographic tailwind. And it's changing. And this is, I think, prophetically significant. Now, this is an area outside of Bethlehem called Solomon's Pools. And I think it's referenced, I think you can make the case that Solomon in Ecclesiastes said, I made me pools of water to water the earth, the wood that bringeth forth trees. And these pools, there's an aqueduct system, and I think they provided water to the temple, and there's aqueducts built by the Hasmoneans and that type of thing in the first or second century BC. And it's clear who built these pools, right? Now, when our State Department issued a report, there was a blogger who talked about this. And the State Department had a big to-do back in October about they're going to give some money to help build them up for tourism and that type of thing and make things better. And the U.S. State Department referred to them as a Palestinian heritage site. They need to go talk to that guy in Kuwait, who just said that there was no state of Palestine. Now, there was an article on the State Department website, but it's now gone. It's been removed because they got called on it. Like, you can't call Solomon's Pools a Palestinian heritage site. And the State Department, even our State Department eventually, I guess, can be forced to get it right. And so they removed that. It's just kind of an interesting, but I think it shows you the bias of the State Department. Melanie Phillips has a good article talking about how do you handle these Jew baiters, these people who hate Jews. And she says essentially in her article, Jerusalem Post, give it right back at them, okay? These people that tell them that they're projecting their evilness on you. They want to collapse society morally. They hate Jews and that type, and call them out for what they really are. And stop acting like if you're nice to them, they're going to change. They're not going to change. You got to take the fight directly to them. And she's right. And it's sort of similar to what happens in the church with same-sex marriage and this transgender thing. Nobody calls it for what it is. And I appreciate somebody like Melanie Phillips who said this is a design to collapse morality and collapse Western civilization so something can come in and take over its place. So that's another good article. Okay, I talked about Lebanon cheat and retreat. Let's see. Okay, this is one of the things that Caroline Glick talked about in her article and in a tweet that she put out yesterday. Turkey, U.S. to stop arming Syrian Kurdish fighters. Even in foreign affairs, they talked about America's forgotten wars and the things that we're not really doing much in Afghanistan, we're not doing much in Iraq. Yeah, we just kind of fought about what we started. Here's what Caroline Glick said in a tweet the other day. Yesterday, U.S. is intent on building a new Russian-Iranian Middle East. What a pathetic, appalling travesty. And that's in response to this report that they're going to stop arming the Kurds, which exist in these countries, in Iraq, in Syria, in Turkey, and Iran. There's this 30 million Kurds, largest ethnic population. Even Mordecai Kadar at the Begin Sadat Center put out an article this week and said, look, there's this move by the Sunni Arab states. They're essentially asking for Israel's help. We can't fall for it because we've done this in the past. And an example of this is, look at what the U.S. is doing. We've said we support Kurdistan, and then when push came to shove, we stopped supporting them. This is from Foreign Affairs. Policymakers in Washington and Jerusalem are also anxious about Iran's military position in Syria near the Golan Heights, from which it could threaten Israel. This is a legitimate concern. Hezbollah, one of the largest Iranian mobilized Iraqi fighter groups in Syria, has already vowed that its next fight will be to liberate the Golan Heights. Syria is not the place to resist Iranian expansionism, however, Foreign Affairs. I disagree with this. Airstrikes won't compel Iranian forces to quit Syria, and ground incursions would simply force the United States to defend territories against sustained Iranian and Syrian unconventional warfare tactics. History indicates that the Iranian and Syrian governments might even recruit jihadists to fight U.S. forces, and the United States could expect little help from Turkey in any conflict with Iran. As a result, many policymakers in Washington and Jerusalem hope that Russia will limit Iran's influence, forestalling the need for a direct military confrontation. These hopes are misguided. Russia will not jeopardize its political and business relationships with Iran, which include shared interests in the Caucasus and Central Asia. Washington and Jerusalem should recognize that they both made their choice years ago. Having accepted that Assad will stay in power, the United States must also accept a newly influential Iran. And it's very interesting how this has all come together, is that I think people know that this is not a good thing, but the question is, how do you fight it? Because what Iran has been able to do is they've been able to essentially build a land bridge now, and the last little chunk of that fell in the last couple of weeks, Abu Kamal in Syria, which was controlled by ISIS, and now there's pretty much free access, flow of access to Iran across Iraq, Syria, all the way to the Mediterranean. And the question is, what do you do about it? Well, you could say you could put fighters into, I don't have my thing. I have a new thing and I don't even have it. You could put fighters into the area there to the south of the bridge and while there are rebel forces there and some Sunni forces there, they're essentially cut off. They're landlocked. It's hard to supply them. So they're not going to be that effective. And all I'm saying is, if you look at it from a Bible prophecy perspective about Persia being on the northern mountains of Israel, this is all set up, is what I'm saying. The Iranians have taken that last part of the land bridge. In this article by Jonathan Spire, he wrote a couple of articles. The Jerusalem Post, Iran puts finishing touches on its bridge to the Golan. You can go and look that up. I think that was in the Jerusalem Post on November 17th. Jonathan Spire, S-P-E-Y-E-R. I don't really have time to go over it this morning, and I'm just about finished here. And then he wrote another article that appeared just the other day in Foreign Policy. Tehran is winning the war for control of the Middle East. And this is, I think, look at what he says, some of what he says in this article. Saudi Arabia appears to be on a warpath across the Middle East. The Saudi orchestrated resignation of Lebanese Prime Minister Saad Hariri and Saudi officials' bellicose rhetoric after the launch of a ballistic missile targeting Riyadh from Yemen appear to herald a new period of assertiveness against Iranian interests across the Middle East. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salam's sudden moves on a variety of fronts may superficially have the feel of Michael Corleone's swift and simultaneous strikes at his family's enemies in the closing frames of The Godfather. Unlike in the film, however, the credits are not about to roll. My wife doesn't like that movie, by the way. I just find it kind of an interesting character study. I really do. Rather, these are the opening moves in an ongoing contest, and it is far from clear that the 32-year-old Crown Prince has found a formula to reverse Iran's advantage. Let's take a look at the track record so far. The confrontation between Saudi Arabia and Iran is taking place across a swath of the Middle East in which, over the last decade, states have partially ceased to function. Iraq and Lebanon, or collapsed completely, as in the case of Syria and Yemen. A war over the ruins has taken place in each country, with Riyadh and Tehran arrayed on opposing sides of all of them. And the result of this is that Iran has effectively won. You even have, and Russia's coming in, like now there's, Ankara said they expected an S-400 missile defense system to be delivered soon. There's these things going on in Saudi Arabia, the detainees who have been suffering at the Ritz-Carlton in Riyadh on mattresses with no sheets are paying out money. And Mohammed bin Salman was interviewed by Thomas Friedman the other day in the New York Times. They claim, Friedman was all excited about, this is a cultural revolution. Everything's going to change in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia's Arab Spring at last. This will be fantastic. This will be great. Everything's going to be fine. But what you find is that in Saudi Arabia, and I didn't know this, and I pay attention to this stuff, was back in September, there was a major crackdown by the Crown Prince on people in Saudi Arabia to the point where he effectively cut off anybody expressing opposition to what he was going to be doing. And then a couple months later, he goes in and does this. In one of his interviews, he said that he expected that the crackdown on corruption would result in the people who have been arrested and detained paying back over $100 billion to the Saudi Arabian government. So we'll see what happens. All I'm saying is all of these different things are going on in the Middle East. But right now, the thing that is most important is that Iran, Persia biblically, is really in ascendancy, and they've gotten themselves put in a place where, what are you going to do? How are you going to stop them? And if they really want to eradicate Israel, and they have the support of Turkey and they have the support of Russia, could Ezekiel 38 and 39 happen in the near term? And the answer is, I think it could. Because this is an alignment that we've never really seen. So it's an exciting time to be alive. We need to keep each other in prayer. There's so much going on culturally. For example, in Sweden, the church there in Sweden says, well, we're not going to call God He anymore. That's just an example of these little things that kind of are continually done to undercut the faith. It's what people call death by 1,000 cuts. You can get one big cut in the right spot and you might bleed to death. Otherwise, it's just a big bad cut and you'll eventually get over it. But you can bleed to death from 1,000 tiny little cuts. And that's sort of what's going on in the world today, is all these little things are undermining our institutions, our governments, our morality, all of these things. And the world is being set up. And we know where this all ends. And it appears that it could be put in place rather quickly. So let's pray and go. Father, thanks again for your word. Pray that you'll bless us this week. Watch over us as we go. In Jesus' name, amen.